To the second published version of The Rime of the Ancient Mariner, Coleridge added a subtitle, A Poet's Reverie. And that word reverie, referring to a dream state, might help us to account for the poem's grip on readers' imaginations, its murky symbolism, its figurative potency. The history of the reception of The Rime of the Ancient Mariner is perhaps unsurprisingly intertwined with the story of psychology. In the 1950s, a Canadian scholar of Coleridge named Kathleen Coburn approached the foundation of Carl Gustav Jung, the Swiss psychologist. Coburn persuaded the foundation associated with Jung that Coleridge was a writer of psychological significance, and that the foundation should heavily invest in producing definitive scholarly editions of Coleridge's works. Coburn hired a team of editors to work under her on Coleridge's various forms of literary output, for he was a voluminous writer whose thought encompassed a range of fields, including not only poetry and plays, but literary lectures, philosophy, religious sayings, and journalism on the state of affairs in his lifetime. The person Coburn selected to edit Coleridge's poetry and plays would later be my undergraduate tutor, J.C.C. Mays. The effort would take Jim more than a quarter of a century. For this work, he was the first owner of a personal computer in the Republic of Ireland, which he had to go and collect personally from Dublin Airport. Jim described strange adventures that led him to recover supposedly lost texts by Coleridge, including times when Coleridge had run out of ink and had to use his own gout medicine instead, or opium, and on one occasion his own blood. There were lines of verse that Coleridge had written on a flap of his own skin. Jim is a good person to start with when we ask whether there is a moral in the Rime of the Ancient Mariner. Jim said that trying to find a moral in the poem is like searching for the core of an onion. There isn't one, and by the time you realise that, you're in tears. But should we expect the Rime of the Ancient Mariner to contain a moral? The short answer is yes, it was conventional at the time. Entertainment wasn't just an amusement ride. People read books or watched plays expecting that there would be lessons for them in it. Therefore, reading a story which appears to centre on crime and punishment, we wonder what the take-home lesson is about how to conduct ourselves. And there does seem to be something offered at the very end of The Ancient Mariner, when the old sailor gives his final words to the wedding guest, before the mariner goes off to tell his tale again and again. This is what he says.
He prayeth best who loveth best all things both great and small. For the dear God who loveth us, he made and loveth all.
This is a fairly conventional piece of Christian morality. It is love one another as I have loved you, extended to the animal kingdom and even into realms of invisible beings hitherto unknown to the mariner. But as a conclusion for this poem, if you've been paying close attention, it's not really satisfactory. The dear God we get at the poem's conclusion hints at a monotheistic vision, which doesn't fit with the world of spirits we've had throughout the poem. The mariner has told us of swirling demonic entities, spirits sliding beneath the ship to drive it forward, and the hellish figures of death and life in death. We might protest that the poem doesn't communicate any such moral as he prayeth best who loveth best all things both great and small. Where do we detect that lesson in the portrayal of day after day of drought, of sunburn, in the depictions of spirits gambling over what should be done with the mariner? Think of those lines, "The game is done, I've won, quoth she and whistled thrice." This is the figure of life in death who has thrown dice successfully against death to win the mariner. Here the mariner seems to be telling us that his universe isn't governed by a benevolent God, but by chance. Whether the Ancient Mariner contains a moral at all has been a heated debate for some time. Among the most famous appraisals is that of Leslie Stephen from 1892. Stephen says, "The moral, which would apparently be that people who sympathise with a man who shoots an albatross will die in prolonged torture of thirst, is open to serious objection." Failing to find a moral in the Ancient Mariner, Stephen illuminated one of the steepest obstacles to that search for a moral. It's difficult to identify a sequence of cause and effect in the rhyme of the Ancient Mariner with any confidence. Events follow each other, one after the other in the poem. We get a succession of episodes, but it's not clear what the relation between them is. It is not certain what the causality is. The mariner's punishment seems to be disproportionate to his wrongdoing, and we might say the same of the deaths of his 200 shipmates. How does it all come about? Why are these things happening? The turning point of the poem appears to be towards the end of part 1, when the wedding guest says, "God save the ancient mariner from the fiends that plagued thee thus. Why look'st thou so? With my crossbow," replies the mariner, "I shot the albatross." And yet this is such a stark, bare piece of narration that it resists analysis. The mariner isn't telling us what was going through his head at the time. He doesn't give us any motivation. He simply depicts mechanically the act of shooting the bird, with no intimation that it would be a moment of such significance. And yet this appears to be the act that precipitates the rest of the poem's action, raising the great Gothic machinery that will persecute the mariner. Cumulatively, by force of repeated reference, the narrative leads us, directs us to consider the shooting of the albatross as the key moment of the poem. The mariner refers back to it repeatedly, like a refrain. These repeated references to the albatross ground us. They give us a touching point to sustain us throughout the succession of bizarre, dreamlike imagery. The crew varies, at one point endorsing the mariner's shooting of the bird that appeared to bring the fog and mist, and then cursing him for shooting the bird that, it seemed, caused the breeze to blow. The crew hangs the albatross around the mariner's neck as punishment. Later, at a cathartic moment in the poem, the bird falls from the mariner's neck, when, in a spontaneous expression of love, he finds himself once more able to pray. Later, the mariner is laid in a trance, in which state he hears two spirits discussing his wrongdoing and his fate. One of those voices explains that the bird was sacred to the spirit under the keel 9 fathom deep that drives the ship forward. The voice says, he loved the bird who loved the man who shot him with his bow. We know that the mariner's ordeal follows his shooting of the albatross, but we need to decide the extent to which the events are brought about by that crime. Any question of morality needs to tally up the fairness of the mariner's punishment with the act he committed. Is the mariner's doom of wandering eternally to tell his tale a fair and just punishment for carelessly dispatching a seabird? So any assessment of the poem's logic would be contestable. But perhaps the search for meaning doesn't necessarily have to entail the extraction of a neat lesson. The meaning in the poem could more properly be said, perhaps, to lie in its figurative potency, the universality of its abstract suggestions. Is there something with which we can all empathize? The feelings of isolation, helplessness, loneliness in the ordeal of the ancient mariner, often adrift at sea, powerless and at the mercy of forces that are incomprehensible to him. Coleridge doesn't leave us entirely clueless in how we're supposed to respond to his poem, because conveniently enough, he's included an audience figure. This is the wedding guest, the addressee of the narrator's tale, and he provides what we could call emotional cues. He responds with fear and pity at different points of the mariner's tale, directing us as readers in turn as to how we should respond to what we read. I think we can conclude, though, that the meaning of the Ancient Mariner doesn't lie in a coherent and clear morality, but instead in something more symbolic and abstract, which inclines us to think of issues such as obscurity and indeterminacy in our final section.